Hola, buenos días, bienvenidos a todos y todas a esta nueva masterclass de el Mes del Diseño 2021, donde estamos celebrando nuestros 10 años de existencia junto con los 10 años del área de diseño del Ministerio de las Culturas. Este año nuestra temática es el diseño en tránsito. Nos estamos cuestionando a partir de los sucesos que han ocurrido los últimos años, tanto como la crisis climática, la crisis sanitaria, política y social que hemos estado viviendo, cuál es el rol que cumple el diseño y cuáles son los bordes y tránsitos con los cuales éste se ha ido encaminando para poder mejorar y tener un rol social más preponderante dentro de la sociedad. Esta masterclass de hoy, que es la cultura digital del diseño, tenemos a dos grandes exponentes e investigadores del diseño. Decir que este evento es parte de la serie de ideas y conversaciones de los tránsitos del diseño con foco en el digitalismo y la pregunta por los objetos, culturas y prácticas emergentes del diseño digital. Como les comentaba, junto al cambio climático, la emergencia de culturas y economías digitales, producto de la revolución tecnológica, se han transformado en los factores más determinantes del cambio social. En ese contexto, es importante preguntarse cómo cambian los objetos que diseñamos y las formas que empleamos para abordar lo digital. En esta charla, Evgeny Morozov explicará diferentes perspectivas de pensar y discutir la práctica del diseño en el contexto de las economías y culturas digitales. Evgeny Morozov es un crítico, investigador y ensayista norteamericano-bielorruso, especializado en las implicancias políticas y culturales de las tecnologías, y ha sido una de las voces más relevantes en la discusión sobre la era digital a través de los escritos en The Guardian, New York Times, Financial Times, The Economist, entre otros medios internacionales. Esta masterclass va a ser moderada por una diseñadora nacional, que es Delfina Fantini van Ditmar. Delfina se graduó de bióloga en la Universidad Católica de Chile. Cursó un año en el Máster en Fine Arts en la Universidad de Konstfack en Estocolmo. En el 2016 se graduó en el doctorado de diseño de Royal College of Arts con la tesis titulada The Hilo. Hoy trabaja en esta institución como profesora e investigadora en el programa de Magíster Design Products Futures. Su trabajo transdisciplinar se centra en las tensiones de inteligencia, diseño, sociedad, arquitectura y medio ambiente. Delfina ha sido profesora visitante en la A.A. Bartlett Manchester School of Art, TU Berlin, Brighton University, Liverpool University, University of Canterbury and Critical Media Lab Basel, entre otras instituciones. Ha participado en diversos eventos académicos, entre ellos en el Centro Pompidou y en el Parlamento Europeo. Recientemente organizó el workshop The Rise of 5G Designing Alternative Urban Aesthetics Futures en el Museo Victoria and Albert en el contexto del London Design Festival. Así que quisiera, por favor, que Delfina prendiera su cámara. Hola, Delfina.
Gracias, Trinidad, por la introducción.
De nada, así que ahora, Delfina, te dejamos a ti. Muchas gracias por participar en esta actividad organizada por el Ministerio de las Culturas, las Artes y el Patrimonio. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a ustedes. Bienvenidos a esta masterclass, donde vamos a abrir el problema del diseño en el contexto de la cultura digital. Los diseñadores no solo somos responsables de soluciones innovadoras, al incorporar tecnologías sociopolíticamente conflictivas en nuestras prácticas, también somos gran parte del problema. En este contexto, es importante preguntarse cuáles son los factores y desafíos de la era digital, cuáles son las tensiones socioecológicas y políticas de estas visiones dominantes, hacia dónde estamos yendo o hacia dónde podemos ir. Y en este contexto es muy fundamental preguntarse cuáles son los pilares de las prácticas digitales que requieren de una reflexión. Es un gran honor estar hoy en conversación con Eugenio Morozov, donde en su libro Para salvar todo, haga clic aquí, él plantea el problema de modelar problemas sociales complejos con soluciones digitales y parámetros basados en optimización, como si todo pudiera resolverse si tan solo tuviéramos los algoritmos adecuados en mano. En este libro, Morozov plantea que la ideología tecno-reduccionista, obviando la complejidad y basado en una pobre comprensión de la naturaleza humana y opacidad de procesos de la vida diaria, enfatiza que el ser humano se lo imagina como un ente que puede ser abordado como un manual. Existen una serie de riesgos cuando la tecnología digital se inserta en nuestros hogares, ciudades y cuerpos. Colocar la tecnología en primer lugar de las personas puede crear desequilibrios de poder que tengan como resultado repercusiones en desigualdades, injusticias, vigilancia indiscriminada y degeneración social. Morozov señala el peligro inminente de un juego de herramientas solucionistas como la opción predeterminada para abordar todos los demás problemas existenciales, desde la desigualdad hasta el cambio climático. Con su crítica, Morozov nos invita a pensar con ambición, responsabilidad e intelectualidad las potenciales reformas necesarias de la era digital. Citándolo, la tecnología usada con imaginación, sin la tradición del solucionismo y el fetichismo de la perfección y eficiencia, puede abrir nuevas vistas para la imaginación, florecimiento del ser humano y abrir caminos hacia ciertas reglas. No hay que olvidar que Chile fue un país pionero en prácticas digitales con el precedente de CyberSyn, tema el cual Morozov ha descrito en The New Yorker. En este artículo, él nos deja con la siguiente reflexión. En 1975, Stafford Beer, líder del proyecto, argumentó: la información es un recurso nacional. Beer se adelantó a su tiempo al tratar la cuestión de la propiedad de los datos como política. ¿Quién llega a poseer los medios de la producción de datos, por no hablar de los datos? Esta discusión no puede reducirse solo a sus dimensiones tecnológicas. Para Chile, país históricamente influenciado por ideas de progreso tecnocrático norteamericanos, pensar críticamente la era digital es de vital importancia. Hoy vamos a comenzar con la charla, la cual será seguida por un espacio de conversación y preguntas del público. Los dejo ahora con la charla de Evgeny.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be addressing you virtually for now. Hopefully, next time we will be able to do it in person. It's a pleasure for me to be speaking to this audience, especially given that I've actually been doing some work recently on Chile myself. Some of it will come out next year, so keep you in suspense for now, but I can also tell you that 7 years ago or so I've written a piece for the New Yorker about Project Cybersyn, so I am somewhat familiar with some of the events in Chilean tragic history of the early 70s and the many connections to design. Maybe I'll get to it later in my talk. For now, maybe let me just say that I don't think of myself as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about design. So, you know, to some extent, this encounter is new and unique for me. I mean, I do think that a lot of the theories and frameworks that I've been working on for the last few years can be fruitfully transposed to the world of design, but you will have to do some of that transposition and some of that thinking. So I'll do my best to make my talk relevant to some of your interests, but again, I have to say that most of my reflections on design are somewhat amateurish, if not forced. I did engage with the questions of design somewhat in my 2013 book called To Save Everything, Click Here, where I describe a phenomenon or an ideology called solutionism, by which at that time I meant an attitude, a very hubristic and arrogant attitude, I must say, to acting in the world, which essentially presumed that problems are found in the world at large ready-made, preconceived somehow and ready to be solved, the way that you would find, I don't know, packaged meat cutlets in a supermarket shelf. And that a lot of people in places like Silicon Valley, but also in its outposts throughout the global north and the global south, were increasingly solving problems by using digital technologies in a very simplified, one-dimensional manner. Back in 2013, I probably did not have the conceptual and theoretical apparatus needed to make full sense of solutionism. I mean, I was relatively young, I wasn't even 30 at the time. So a lot of these theories that I did produce, they do look somewhat incomplete, I would say, from the vantage point of 2021. So I spent the 7-8 years that followed since the publication of that book trying to build solutionism into a more robust paradigm. Which I will explain to you now, and I will connect it to the questions of design. But let me also say a few words about how I thought about some of the solutions that design could offer back in 2013. So if, of course, you start with my definition of solutionism as something that, in a very simplistic, one-dimensional manner, imposes a certain legibility, one-dimensional legibility onto the world, and it basically defines what problems are and how to solve them, you would, of course, think that design of a very particular and peculiar variety might offer a solution. So back then, I was quite impressed by some of the ideas coming out of cybernetics and in sort of human-computer interaction. People like Usman Haque, for example, who followed in the tradition of Gordon Pask, this kind of second-order cybernetics with a little bit of playfulness, creativity, and so forth, provided one way for me to think about how users of technologies can not just be involved in sort of co-design and co-creation, but how they can be made into some kind of leading actors of producing technological and design systems that were not even preconceived by the designer themselves. So it's not a matter of just participation, it's a matter of actually having these users produce effects at a systemic level that were completely unique and were not predicted by the designers of the system. The second strand in my thinking back in 2013 had to do with theories of adversarial design, which you will find in the work of some design theorists like Carlo Di Salvo, for example, whom I reference in the book, who builds on people like and thinkers like Chantal Mouffe, for example, in arguing that it's possible also through design to somehow provoke and show that society, in fact, is agonistic, it's not homogeneous, that there is no consensus, and that one can think of artifacts and approaches to design that will somehow reveal this conflictual nature of society and of the public sphere. So instead of designing for consensus, designing for homogeneity, we will be designing for dissensus, agonism, and heterogeneity. What that meant in practice was not exactly clear even to me, because beyond just a handful of art projects, and a lot of these initiatives, including those of Usman Haque, but also those informed by adversarial design, they inevitably end up sliding into the category of art, and they can be extremely agonistic and provocative, and they can take advantage of the users, or they can even conceive of users as a completely different social group. But the bottom line is that it's very hard to think of these artifacts producing large-scale political, economic, and social transformation, which I would argue today, maybe not in 2013, is ultimately what design should contribute to. It's not a matter of innovating in as radical of a manner as you can imagine at the edges of the system, Rather, it's finding ways through which an entirely new set of structures, political, economic, cultural ones, can be assisted in emerging. Of course, it became obvious to me as time went on that you cannot expect so much from design, no matter how radical and revolutionary. If you look at your own history, if you look at the Chilean history, when you have something like the Institute of what is called Technology and Design, INTAC, formed within Corfo in the early 1970s, and you have somebody like Guy Bonsiep, a very prominent designer and design theorist and practitioner who cut his teeth at the Ulm School of Design, coming to Chile in 1968 and essentially working with ILO and then eventually in INTAC on building artifacts that would transform the revolutionary program, or at least let's say the radical, structurally transformative program of Allende into technologies and artifacts and consumer objects. And you know some of those objects probably much better than I do. You can look at how they designed very particular spoons for distributing powdered milk. You can look at the ways in which they designed even fridges or many other consumer objects, on the idea that it's not only a matter of building this capacity domestically to save foreign currency, but it's also building things much more efficiently, reducing the product line from 60 fridges that were produced to just 5, so that you can actually save money in building them. So there was a political program, and that political program was translatable in the language of objects and artifacts, and that's why somebody like Guy Bonsiep could have theorized it in the early 1970s using all sorts of interesting theoretical frameworks like the center and the periphery, and it was kind of obvious was not obvious, but it was at least straightforward and rational to draw the conclusions from the political and economic program to the design and technological program. And to some extent, you can also look at Project Cyberscene, and at least as it got expressed in design with the fantastic screens and the chairs and the operations room, to some extent as the highlight and as the pinnacle of that design program. And that design program was not about building Star Trek-like room, which is how a lot of people in the North American kind of global North context see it. It was rather about building a system for managing the Chilean economy and then needing the right sets of cognitive support systems, as somebody like Bonsiep would call it later on, in order to do the job. So again, you have a very clear political economic program, and you have a design agenda to go along with it. The problem that I think we're experiencing now is of a different kind, in that the political and economic program, to which this more radical vision of design that does not collapse into solutionism can attach itself, simply does not seem to exist. We do not know what's at the other end of neoliberalism, and save for some kind of usual leftist rhetoric about restoring the welfare state, which in parts of Latin America never really existed, so I don't want to claim that it's a debate that happens everywhere, but in Europe at least, which is where I'm now in Italy, that's what the left says, that we need to basically reverse the last 25, 30 years of privatization, austerity, cuts, privatization of the welfare state, outsourcing, you name it. And all of that is fine, but it's still, it's a program that is not reactionary, but reactive. It tries to basically undo what neoliberalism has done without fostering nothing of new or original to stand in its place. And this is where I think we have to look at what are some of the possibilities that information technology and by extension design offer us in articulating what a new, a different and proactive rather than reactive socioeconomic paradigm to which this more radical vision for design can attach itself be like. And this is where I think we're having some difficulty. And I think this is where, before I go into articulating what I see as that difficulty, I need to say a few words perhaps about how my own views on solutionism have changed. So as I described at the beginning, for me, at least in 2012, 2013, when I first started toying with this term, which by the way, I found in a book about architecture, and one of, I think, sort of critical books published on architecture and urban planning, and an unknown, or literally unknown, or virtually unknown book. I was close to completing my manuscript, and I was flying, I think, from Europe to the US, and I looked at that book, and I was like, wow, the guy talks about solutionism. That seems like a framework that totally captures what I've been trying to say in the book. So that aside, my definition of solutionism back then, as I have just described, was some kind of an ideology. It was basically a bunch of confused people who were technocratic in outlook, who could not appreciate defined points of existence. They have not read Heidegger. They have not even read, I don't know, smaller and less complicated thinkers. And they were just applying this engineering mentality. And in the end, my own critique ended up sounding almost conservative in nature, because I seem to be attacking any effort or any attempt to apply engineering and design itself to the solution of social problems. And at some point, and it was already obvious to me at the time, even though I did not make a super explicit attempt to distance myself from such interpretation, but already then it was obvious that some of the things I was saying sounded rather conservative in nature, and they might have as well come out from the mouth of, Friedrich Hayek or Michael Oakeshott, this very prominent British conservative thinker, people who essentially argued that this rationalistic approach to understanding what makes society tick is just not adequate, and it's likely to lead to totalitarianism, or it's likely to lead to some kind of other disaster. And one of those disasters I pointed out was the takeover by Silicon Valley under the guise of solutionism. Looking at those early and somewhat immature theoretical efforts of 2013 from the perspective of 2021, it's obvious to me that the term solutionism came at the right time, and I think it's a very good and useful term, but it cannot just be left hanging as an ideology. It has to tie itself to some kind of real structural developments inside our global capitalist system. Right? And it has to refer to something real and not just to a bunch of misunderstandings and people not reading Heidegger or not reading, Hannah Arendt or, you name it. And as I spent some time thinking through some of this kind of broader economic and political conditions of possibility that made solutionism possible, it became clear to me that on the one hand, I don't have time to go into solutionism because I want to talk about design, so I'll just give you a very short 3-minute intro, and I'll cut a lot of corners, but it will get us the basics. So the way I started thinking about it now is that solutionism to some extent does point to a real structural transformation, not just in our economy, but in our society at large. And it has to do with the wide ubiquity of information technology in our everyday life. And it has to do with the falling costs of deploying that technology to somehow engage in social action, social coordination, collective action, problem solving, you name it. It just seems to me impossible to deny that the ability of an average person, both in the global north and in the global south now, to analyze what's going on around them, to build a plan of action of some kind, and to realize that plan of action by acting out on it, either individually or together with other people, that ability is far greater than it was, let's say, in 1970, let alone in 1950. We have tons of tools at our disposal. We have the ability to program some of them. The world has become observable or more observable than it was before. It has become more plastic. And overall, our capacity to be like gods, to use this phrase that countercultural heroes of 1960s America, like Stuart Brand, used to throw around a lot, our ability to act like gods has definitely increased. Theoretically. So theoretically, of course, it has increased, and to some extent, why do I say theoretically? Because there is also an underlying structure that limits the full utilization of all this potential, and it channels it in a way that is, I don't want to say market conforming, but it's something that in the end stabilizes the capitalist system. And it's very important to understand that all this immense growth in plasticity and in our capacity to do things and to act, which is undeniable, it has been put into the capitalist straitjacket so that anytime we want to innovate at scale and we don't want to do something in a way that has not been done before, and we want to share that insight with others, and we want to make sure that society gets transformed as a result, the default path available to us, in most cases, is to do it on terms that will insert some kind of a venture capital, digital platform, online advertising intermediary in the middle of all this creative action, which will then channel what we can and cannot do in a certain direction, and it will impose extra considerations and imperatives on us, which at the end of the day means that in 99% of cases, if you have a good idea of how to use this immense plasticity and observability and collective action that has been made possible through the digital, you need to think through your options through a very peculiar mental template. And that's a mental template that almost forces you to become an entrepreneur, to form a startup, to seek venture capital, to attract it, to essentially come up with a business plan, to draw out a business model, and almost inevitably that business model will involve creating enclosures and commodifying things that have previously not been commodified, or it will involve collecting and harvesting user data, packaging it, selling it, doing something with it. That's a much more likely trajectory in this new solutionist universe, regardless of just how many other options and opportunities exist. Of course you can be forming an NGO. Of course you can be building some kind of a public good infrastructure. Of course, all these things are theoretically possible, which adds extra legitimacy to the system, because ultimately people in Wall Street, in Silicon Valley, in the World Bank, they can tell you, oh, look, but all these technologies, they're out there. Why don't you just use them if you want to cure cancer or solve hunger or, improve your road in your neighborhood? Go and use them any way you want. You don't have to be a startup. You don't have to form a company. You can be anything. But of course, once you start looking at the details of how all of these things actually work in practice, you realize that if you do want to use artificial intelligence or cloud computing or facial recognition or any of these new digital infrastructures, and you want to use it at scale, you will need to pay to the providers of the services. So you need to pay to Amazon, to Google, to Alibaba, to Microsoft, to whoever, and it will not be cheap, which means that you need to have some cash flow. So you need to hire people who will actually be able to manage these services and put them together and configure the APIs. Well, that means you have to be able to pay salaries to highly skilled tech personnel. And because salaries got so inflated because of big tech, you have no choice but to essentially raise money in order to pay them. So this theoretical option of embracing an organizational identity that is something other than a startup, it exists. In practice, however, it doesn't. So, there are exceptions. You can be an NGO, but then you have to work within this universe of philanthropic capitalism, which some might argue is even worse than capitalism itself, or you have to become a startup. And in these conditions, the question then becomes, so what is the radical option? What is it that we can do to get ourselves out of this trap in which we are in. And this is where I think a lot of people, having realized that there is a problem with the absence of truly transformative, proactive measures on the left, they have started thinking about ways in which some of these infrastructures, from big data to cloud computing, can actually be utilized in order to maybe do something far more radical than just restoring the welfare state or reversing privatization. And in this case, what would that something be? So one option is sort of humanizing the tech giants, and I would argue that a lot of social democrats would rather go that way. So you find a way to tax them, but you keep delegating more and more responsibility for problem solving to them. So you'll end up with Facebook and Google and Amazon running your postal service system and running your healthcare system and education system, but maybe they pay taxes, maybe they submit bids on official tenders run by the governments, and you essentially find a way to hold them responsible by delegating more and more stuff to them, which at the end raises the question of by what logic could you even call that social democracy? You essentially end up in a fully privatized corporate-run society where there is some semblance of a welfare state, but it's entirely run by a bunch of mostly American corporations. So that doesn't seem like a very prominent option, even though it is quite likely, especially now in the wake of the COVID crisis, as society starts to rebuild itself. We are taking on enormous debt. We are already in huge dependence on these tech giants. So I would argue that there is a huge possibility that we will end up even more dependent on them as time goes by. And it wouldn't be so. It would be tragic, it wouldn't be so worth discussing and remarking upon if only there were not some forces on the left who still think that all of that somehow constitutes victory because they managed to get this otherwise nasty corporations to do things that are a little bit nicer, like paying taxes. That just shows you how low the ambition of the social democratic project has fallen. On the more radical end of things, there is of course this option of, hey, now we have all this big data, we have AI, we have cloud computing, we have a lot of things that can be used in order to build a different future. Why don't we try to recover central planning with it? And that goes back to the argument, we can call it socialist calculation debate, that stretches almost over a century now about whether central planning can be made to work. Some people have said no, some people have said yes. I mean, as the Soviet Union fell apart, more and more people started believing that no central planning is actually feasible. And now suddenly with big data and AI, there is a realization that maybe we can, in fact, make central planning work by feeding more data, feeding better algorithms, automating more things, everything will be fine. And you can see that designers will have some role to play in all of that, as they will eventually be helping to roll out many of the systems. But even there, you see that it's not, it's not really the kind of design that builds on some of the innovations in design theory and practice over the last 40 years, the way in which we managed to conceptualize, for example, the role of the interface, the way in which we have kind of introduced the external and cognitive dimensions into how we conceptualize the design of artifacts. I mean, all of this kind of softer environmental, external, intermediary steps, they don't really figure much in this process. It all becomes about, hey, let's just build more infrastructures and sensors for harvesting data, feed it into the system, and then maybe the task of the designer will be to build another operations room, like we had this project, or you had rather, this project Cybersyn in Chile, and then we will just be building more and more of them, and the role then will be that of visualization and information design of some kind, or knowledge design or engineering, as it used to be fashionable to say in the early 1990s, and the goal would be trying to represent the economy in better ways so that better decisions can be made by central planners. So the role of designer becomes that. And in a funny way, even someone like Guy Bonsiep, who helped design the operations room, if you look at the evolution of his own work, by the time he arrives to California in the late 1980s, and he starts working on the question of the interface from a kind of Heideggerian perspective inspired by Vinogradov and Flores, another of your compatriots, he essentially says something very similar. Only, of course, without the background of central planning that could be revitalized through big data, which is something that I am introducing here. I would argue, however, that, and I don't have much time to build the solid theoretical case for this, but so I will have to, again, jump through the hoops, but let me argue it nonetheless. I would argue that there is, however, another possibility, and that possibility has to do with a radical revision of how people on the left, Marxists, non-Marxists, let's not get into that fight, how they conceptualize their big political task, but also philosophical task. Right? Traditionally, if you read Marx, and if you read a lot of people who followed him, the assumption goes something like this, or the assumption about priorities goes something like this. Ontologically, there is a distinction between what Marx calls the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom. Realm of necessity is where we're talking about essentially all of our essential needs: eating, sleeping, breathing, etc. Very basic human needs which must be satisfied in order for people to essentially continue living. These needs, of course, can be flexible, and they can, not flexible, but they're historical, right? So, I mean, some of them might look permanent and eternal, but in fact, what counts as a need, that itself evolves as society evolves, conflicts emerge, etc. So that's the realm of necessity, and it's very important that we essentially figure it all out before we can kind of think about this other realm, which is the realm of freedom, which is the realm associated with free time, creativity, us essentially partaking in all sorts of activities that might expand our horizons, might make our life more meaningful, and so forth. So the default, and of course you can complicate it now with climate problem, etc. Maybe we need a third realm, the realm of crisis. We can argue about all of that. But I think it's important to understand that as the questions of strategy and prioritizing go, most Marxists have concentrated, and most leftists, let's not call it Marxists, and the only reason I'm even bringing it up because my default assumption is that neoliberalism kind of defines our cognitive space right now, and that also defines how we think about design. That's why I need to bring all this leftist baggage. So I apologize if you don't agree with the illogical premises. But ultimately, the priority on the left has always been about figuring out what to do about the realm of necessity. Once we sort it out, we can then think about the realm of freedom. So all of the technical know-how, all of the science, all of the rationalization, all of that is channeled into making the realm of necessity as rational as possible. So we want to have central planning instead of the turbulence of the market. We want to rationalize how the economy operates. We want to make it simpler. Right now it's too complex. We have all these brand varieties, product varieties. It's all wasteful. We need to make things rational and simple. Once we make it rational and simple, we'll reduce waste, we'll feed everyone. And then once everybody is fed, then they can think about freedom, creativity, self-expression, democracy, etc., etc. Now, it's an interesting and to some extent for mid-19th century irrelevant way to frame things. It also, makes a lot of assumptions, especially as Marx got interpreted in the early 20th century by other economists. It makes a lot of assumptions about human action, right? So, to what extent efficiency is, for example, effectiveness is a feature of instrumental action, and to what extent action that is, let's say, artistic or normative or religious is to be judged by a very different set of criteria. So if you think about instrumental action that has a certain goal, it has a certain output in mind, and it searches for the right inputs, or it searches for the right means to achieve the goal and to do it in the most effective, which mostly means cost-effective manner, that action can in fact be evaluated in terms of efficiency. You can think about how to rationalize it, how to optimize it, so forth. And these are questions that designers have been tackling for a long time. That conception of action, which lies at the heart of how we conceptualize the economic sphere, how we conceptualize this broad realm of necessity, if you will, I would argue that it's a very outdated theory and that it doesn't actually reconcile very well with a theory of action that can corresponds much better to how we actually act in the world. And I would argue that all sorts of dichotomies, that this assumption about the distinction between instrumental and, let's say, artistic action, these assumptions, they were wrong in the 19th century and they are wrong now. And that a much better theory of action would assume that all action potentially is pregnant with a creative dimension. That dimension is activated whenever we run into a problem of some kind or an obstacle. And in the best of circumstances, us running into that problem and engaging in some kind of creative action or creative behavior results in the emergence of a new practice, right? Of a new practice of some kind, because ultimately we had to furnish a unique solution to a situation that we have not encountered before. Now, if we are lucky and if we have the right communication infrastructure or social infrastructure or political infrastructure, this discovery of ours, this technique that we have come up with to resolve a certain problem that stood in the way, it can become part of a social repertoire of techniques, and it can eventually propagate through society and contribute to the total stock of knowledge, essentially expanding it. Now, the premise of the neoliberal project is that it's only by economizing everything, it's by turning everybody into a consumer and entrepreneur, by subjecting them to the discipline of what some of the neoliberal thinkers like Hayek would call the cash nexus, that we would be able to establish this conveyor belt between creative activity of individuals and the institutionalization of these creative acts at a social level, so that they would then propagate through the rest of society because other entrepreneurs would take them on. And the entire theory of why market competition is a good thing, of somebody like Hayek, is built around that central insight, that discovery for Hayek is competition for Hayek is a discovery procedure, precisely because it has a way to spread these individual innovations that happen in the system to other parts of society, thus lifting everyone's boats, so to say. What I think people on the left have missed is that if they start with a different conceptualization of action, they would eventually understand that Hayek to some extent is right to point to competition as one mechanism for the institutionalization of creative social practices at a higher level. Where he goes wrong is in juxtaposing it to central planning and pretending that other ways to produce, elicit, and institutionalize these social practices outside of the realm of the market do not exist. Right? And this is where, if you look at how our digital society now works, at least at the edges of it, not at the core, but at the edges, let's say on the periphery of it, you will see that, hey, I mean, in some cases, if you look especially at what's happening around free software and open source communities, I mean, people are constantly refining and finding new ways to do something better. They manage then to share these techniques and practices with everybody else. This knowledge then propagates through the entire system and in many cases gets added to the code base, right? It can be added to the platform, can be added to the operating system, you name it. There is no economic motivation in most of the cases driving them. And it shows you that there is also no presumption that people who are engaging in these innovative practices are doing it because they're expecting a gain or that they explicitly are acting in the economic sphere, right? Which makes you think immediately that if you find ways in which people can become more self-reflexive about what they do, if they can monitor acts of behavior in which they actually engage, if they can then analyze about how to intervene upon their behavior so that to perhaps do things better, more efficiently, you name it, the criteria can be different. And if they then have a system through which to share this innovative behaviors and insights with the others, then you will be building a system that produces value, that allows us to reproduce ourselves, society, communities, and neighborhoods in ways that actually do not presuppose that we are doing all of that in the realm of necessity, right? So we might as well be acting in the realm of freedom. Imagine if I want to learn a foreign language and I want to learn it because I just think it's a cool thing to do. I start tinkering with all sorts of apps to do it. In the end, I realize that this app can be improved, and I actually do my best to improve it, and I know a little bit of coding, and I actually add a couple of features, and then those features propagate through the entirety of users who are using it, and then they can learn their foreign language faster and better and more efficiently. And is it something that is restricted to the realm of necessity? No, it's something that's happening by and large in the realm of freedom, but you can also see how in that realm of freedom, a lot of supporting infrastructures can be built and designed in order to make me more reflexive about what I do, in order to make it easier for me to intervene on the processes in which I'm already engaged by doing something with this immense plasticity of the social world that is there, because that world is also digital, and then to facilitate my sharing of that insight with other people. And essentially, if we manage to turn the tables in terms of thinking about primacy and what comes first, what comes second, whether we first have to think about figuring out all of our basic needs and only then think about creativity, or whether to think about creativity as something that is potentially already embedded and present in every single action that we undertake, and then the task of the designer is to essentially extract or facilitate the emergence of that creative potential, its consolidation, and its sharing with the rest of the world on terms that do not default to terms of Silicon Valley and digital platforms and the rest of the solutionist apparatus. That to me points in the direction in which design should essentially go. So it becomes a design of systems that allow us to build for maximizing behavior that is truly creative and emancipatory, that contributes to the solution of many of our needs, even if we do not explicitly seek to address those needs to begin with. So then the task of the designer becomes essentially that of figuring out what kind of support infrastructures we need to facilitate social coordination among people, to facilitate collective action, to facilitate acts of discovery, the way Hayek talks about competition, but thinking about other mechanisms of discovery. I mean, who said that solidarity could not be an engine of discovery? Don't we discover new things about how to do certain activities when we are driven by a sense of altruism or solidarity? Of course we do. We just don't have the right legal and economic infrastructures to turn that into a reality. So I'm running out of time here, but the message with which I would like to leave you is that once we manage to resolve some of the outstanding problems in sort of leftist theory, which currently precludes us from articulating an intellectual counter-paradigm to neoliberalism, I think design will find its place in it, and designers will be extremely important in that fight. But the task, unfortunately, right now, the intellectual and political task, it's not just that, it does not just rest with the designers themselves. I mean, what we are lacking is that broader intellectual framework, and I've been working on it now for 7 or 8 years, and hopefully next year something will see light of day with the publication of my book. But I would just like to, again, encourage you to try to link your practice and your praxis, so to say, to this broader theoretical conditions of possibility, because it's only by elucidating them that we would be able to transform the world politically and intellectually and bring it to a point where design can actually make a difference politically, economically, socially, and culturally. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Bienvenido, Evgeny. Muchas gracias por tu charla. Es un gran honor estar hoy en conversación contigo y también escuchar sobre la maduración de las ideas desde la publicación de tu libro en el 2013. Bien mencionas en tu charla la relevancia de reflexionar sobre el concepto de la necesidad, lo cual podemos conectar a esta idea de la smartificación de la vida guiada por estos tecnócratas en Silicon Valley, lo cual obviamente resulta en una neoliberalización de la cotidianidad y también bastante basado en el consumo. Esto nuevamente nos lleva a la importancia del pluralismo, la creación de sistemas alternativos y el contraparadigma. Eso creo que es la mejor traducción a counter paradigm. Voy a partir con un par de preguntas y después voy a abrir este espacio al público, que me imagino tiene muchas cosas para preguntarte, así que por favor usen esta instancia para tener las respuestas de Evgeny. En tu libro del 2013, tú mencionas que la tecnología usada con imaginación, sin la tradición solucionista y el fetichismo, puede abrir nuevas vistas para el florecimiento del ser humano. En esta charla tú mencionas la importancia de la heterogeneidad y pluralismo. ¿Tienes buenos ejemplos de diseño en relación a estas propuestas que puedas compartir con nosotros?
Well, again, as I thank you first of all very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be participating in this Q&A after the talk. I think, as I've told you, I mean, in the beginning of that lecture, I mean, I don't really think of myself as a design theorist. So, you know, when I use examples, for me, I don't necessarily file them in a folder called design, because I have nothing to do with that folder, to be honest. But thinking about examples, I think the message that I've been trying to communicate with regards to this counter paradigm that you've mentioned is it's very simple. I mean, we are all, in a sense, designers in our everyday life. I mean, we are constantly confronted with problems. Some of those problems are more existential than others, but they're problems nonetheless. And whether it's fixing your coffee machine or finding a way to plug a leak in your plumbing system, or finding a better way to study a foreign language, I mean, there is really no I think shortage of everyday problems where important innovations, to use a fancy word, are made. I mean, we are constantly tinkering and modifying the infrastructure of everyday life. I mean, the problem is that right now, as I was trying to say in my talk, I mean, right now, it's either that what's expected of us is to then become entrepreneurs and form a startup and raise money and then monetize it, or it's to do nothing. So this kind of burst of creativity is localized, and it's never shared socially, and it never enters some kind of global circulation. So, you know, I'm not. I mean, I would understand the debate in the 60s and 70s, you know, when there was the need to somehow make design coexist with science, and there was a need to apply operational research or cybernetics or system theory to understand how do you design better products with better interfaces that would be of better use to the human users. And I think, you know, of course, a lot of these conversations and approaches are still valid and should continue. But I think the paradigm I'm offering radically questions whether that's all that we can do. And in that sense, unlocking this creative potential that each of us has by means of designing the right environments and systems, not just environments. So it's not just technological design, it's also legal design, economic design, political design. It's also about designing institutions. So we have to conceive of the role of the designer here much more broadly.
Thank you. I completely agree with you, especially in the last bit where you mentioned the strategic role that design can have. Just to give you an example that I discovered during my PhD, that is a very simple exercise, but I really realized how different ideologies can completely change the idea of smartification. Once I asked some people to behave like the AI of a fridge, so I invited a banker. When I put a banker in the role of the intelligence of a fridge, immediately it started thinking on reselling data and charging you a lot of money if that was not the case, or immediately it connected the idea of fridge and a big chain. When I put a screenwriter, coming again from left ideology, the first thing he came up with this idea of smart fridge was, how can we make the best use of the community? How can we share food? How can we make this fridge super sustainable? So that's just a little example coming from a design perspective, bringing different ideologies in this smart position can allow extremely different answers. So there's a big potential for designers to attack this problem, as you say, in all of these fields. Now moving on to the idea that societies change, problems change. In Chile, we are 2 years ahead of the social revolution. So this brings light in potential issues of design and also about power structures. Learning from the failures and also examples of the global north, I would be very interested to hear what are your insights about which other kind of smart cities could we imagine for the global south that is still thinking that this is like a potential path to go?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great question, and I'm sorry to sound like a broken record in a sense, but I think ultimately the paucity and the absence of thinking about these issues from the kind of more progressive democratic perspective has to do with the absence of an alternative that will tell you what these technologies are for. What is it that we want to do with them? And so far, whether it's at the level of the city with smart cities, whether it's the level of the nation with some kind of new alternative planning systems, the problem is that we don't know what they're for. So we know that they should not be impinging upon our privacy. They should not be engaging in surveillance. We know that they should not be collecting data. We know what these technologies are not supposed to be doing. But since we are lacking this coherent project, what it is that we want to do, we cannot really articulate a strategy for how to design different smart cities or different infrastructures of technology. And this is where essentially, we have to reach out for some of the ideas from the 1960s. And, this is where we go and we read Lefebvre and we say, no, maybe we need to understand how to incorporate the right to the city to smart cities. Never mind that we never figured out how to incorporate it into actual cities. Now we want to figure out how to incorporate it into the smart cities. And to some extent, looking at it from the perspective, again, of the global north, even the resurgence of interest in Project Cybersyn, in Chile itself, to some extent, it's a reflection of this lack of alternatives. All we can do is just to look at the experience of 1971 in Chile, and we think that Project Cybersyn has lessons to teach to us what to do in the future. Right? And maybe it does, and probably it does. But the fact that we are almost constitutionally incapable, and I say constitutionally here in a very different sense of the word, incapable of understanding what the proactive active policy for technological infrastructure should be. If it's not to nationalize or socialize enterprises, as it might have been in the early 1970s, what do we want to do with these technologies? And this is why, I spend so much time in my talk also trying to articulate that we're essentially missing a bigger intellectual project, and that the counter paradigm to neoliberalism cannot just be the defense of the welfare state or the recovery of free education or whatever. All of these are nice things to have, but I just think they're not ambitious enough as a proper counter paradigm to that project.
Thank you. I completely agree, and I think a really important issue to address is inequality. whenever we think about this. And there is a very good book, it's called Automating Inequality. It really shows how this datification of life can really put inequality all the way around, can really enhance it if it's not thought in the correct way. So that's really important, especially for countries and places where we have these high pyramidal societies, as is the case.
Can I make another just a very short comment now, because it's something that you said prompted some reflections. I mean, it's all true what you're saying, but I think especially people in the global south have to be careful not to fall into this dictatorship of no alternatives that comes from the global north. Because I mean, partly I think this concern with privacy, surveillance, all this kind of typical concerns, freedom of expression, digital rights. I mean, all of this are very important, don't get me wrong, but it's a very North American / European kind of concern because, and it's a concern in these regions because the power of big tech is impossible to deny, but it's also obvious that there is no political or economic counter project to them. So all we can do is to tap into all sorts of legalistic problems, whether it's violation of privacy or freedom of expression. I mean, and it's fine, but it should not just occupy the whole bandwidth of the debate. And that's why I think, the global south, simply because its problems are different, its openness to alternative solutions is different, it's much more prepared to experiment with institutional forms that the global north maybe would not. It's probably where this counter paradigm is likely to emerge. It's not going to emerge in Europe or North America.
I agree with you. And I think we really need to be loyal to that strength that we have, and that, is the new world. We can think things differently, but then also we should stop, because we're the new world, we also should stop looking at this north and importing the technology and all the paradigms that come with it. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I'm going to start now with the public. Sure. So there's a question from Anna Busoni, which is asking, which are the best allies that we can find in our roads to innovation? And then she's asking about vernacular communities, and she continues her question with other allies in other disciplines, and she mentions sociology as one of the potential ones.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, look, I don't think that searching for allies based on a discipline is necessarily a good move. I mean, surely if you find a list of 20 allies, they might happen to be in different disciplines. I just don't think that this is primarily an academic question. I mean, of course, if we want to challenge certain assumptions about, I was talking, for example, about theory of action and how, our theory of action still is stuck in this dichotomy between instrumental, efficiency-oriented action and normative action. That's something you can find in the sociology of Talcott Parsons from 1960s. So of course you do need sociologists, and I draw on one, a German sociologist, for example, Hans Jonas, who does articulate this creative action as a kind of third dimension of all action. So, I mean, you can, of course, find people for specific tasks of the intellectual project that is dear to my heart, but I don't want to present it as a project that should be hegemonic and universal. So, broadly speaking, I think it will have to be a combination of people questioning the premises of economic theory, and you have to basically understand that economics has become the uber arch discipline of social sciences, and it defines debates in many fields in ways that we don't even understand. I mean, now all of a sudden everybody talks about market design, for example, right? And we understand that markets is something that is to be designed, and all of a sudden economists have become designers, and nobody expected that to happen 20 or 25 years ago. So as far as I'm concerned, any discipline that can help question the hegemonic nature of that paradigm would be, a move in the right direction. But yes, I mean, a lot of this questioning will, of course, come from the bottom-up users, including vernacular, indigenous, and many other communities who just, who I do think are, to some extent, very useful allies in revealing the bankruptcy of many of the assumptions made, both about action, but also about institutions, change, and whatnot. And the more we can represent their experience, the easier it would be to challenge this account.
Thank you. We have a question now from John Race, I'm not sure if you hear mentioning that you want to speak it out loud. I'm not sure that this is allowed in the webinar. But if it's not, can you just type it, please? Thank you. And also here we have a comment from Martin Pott, thanking you for the fine talk. And here he mentions, when it concerns about necessities of freedom, he has tried to synthesize it in a book called Home in a Hybrid World about dwelling in a networked world. He says it tries to return to this issue to the inhabitant, given that this does not occur in a level playing field. This is a fundamental role for inhabitants to achieve freedom. Was a comment more than a question. So now we're just waiting for John to type the question.
Sure.
He's asking about how many books do you manage to read in a month or a year in your busy life?
Well, my life is not that busy, so I read a lot of books. I don't know, it's a hard question. It depends also on, well, how should I say? I read very fast and I know how to skip things I don't need. So I would say easily a few hundred a year, but months, I don't know, 20 maybe, something like that. But I also read a lot of academic articles. But I also have to understand, I live in a village and I spend a lot of time reading. So I'm not a good yardstick or benchmark against which to judge reading habits.
Thank you. There is here a question in the Q&A while we wait for John.
Sure.
It's from Jose Alart from the Catholic University. He said, I am concerned about this apparent digital determinism. Is it digital disconnection, total or partial, a valid or possible alternative, and not necessarily naive romantic position?
Sure. And I see that we also have another question, so maybe I'll tackle that one and then we move to the one from John. So disconnection, well, I wouldn't recommend it in that I don't see connectivity itself as an issue. And this is where, design can actually help us get a hold and a grasp on many of the factors that result in current processes of connectivity being so stressful. And I think, the way in which our online experience now is packaged and dispatched to us as some kind of either or thing. You're either online or you are offline. And if you are online, it's okay to be bombarded by 300 messages and to be constantly interrupted. And I mean, that's all highly contingent, right? And it just happens that this bombardment currently favors the business models of the main digital platforms that need your attention, that need to keep you always on the platform, because this is what drives up their essentially business model. It drives up their valuations. And you can, of course, think of an online experience being completely different, being much more sane, being much more focused on serendipity and discovery and engagement. And that would require deliberate design, and it will require quite a lot of money and funds and commitments, but so be it. I mean, we need to accept that without planning of some kind, without design of some kind, these things will not happen spontaneously. And it's futile to be expecting Facebook and Google and Twitter to just wake up to their role and their responsibility and then do it on their own. I don't think it's going to happen. So with regards to the other question, I can read it. I don't know if everybody reads it, so I don't know if you should. I love that you mentioned the possibility of the Global South choosing a different path. I was wondering what your opinion was on the recent popularity of Web 3.0 tech. How would that play a role in this ability to choose? Big tech is quickly learning about this new field. Perhaps we still have a chance of owning that new advance in technology before it's being monopolized by big tech, especially since Web 3.0 is supposed to be decentralized. Well, I mean, I'm old enough to remember, Web 3.0 being thrown around as a term before there was even crypto and the blockchain. But assume in this context, this is what Web 3.0 refers to. So I don't personally put a lot of emphasis on the power of decentralization, but again, it has to do with the way that I diagnose the problem. I don't think that the problem originates in decentralization of power, which now needs to be decentralized. I mean, it is an important problem. For me, it's just not the problem. And you cannot fight, if you want to call it, the neoliberal or whatever project, just by building institutions that are decentralized, because that project does not advance and propagate itself through centralization. And I'm willing to bet money that it will be as resilient in a decentralized way and manner. So I see most of the discussions, projects, platforms around Web 3.0, so to say, as kind of distractions, to be honest, because again, they're not questioning what the real problem is. And I don't blame them, because people who are much more politically sophisticated, who are the intellectuals and politicians, who are supposed to be articulating the premises, the basic premises of this alternative project, are even more helpless and are not doing anything at all. So, but no, I don't put much stock in it will make a lot of people rich, that I don't doubt, but I don't see it as emancipatory.
Thank you. And I will read maybe the last question. Is from Ekatis Cancela, and it says, could you please explain which should be the role of the state on designing those new institutions that can pursue creative purposes? I heard you mention the idea of the state as an operating system.
Well, look, the state here would be, of course, crucial and fundamental, and there is now dancing around that fact. Ultimately, the state will have to be the one that will be rolling out a lot of these infrastructures and designing them, and essentially figuring out how do you build institutions that would be able to facilitate the emergence of all this creative practices, and how do you consolidate and kind of spread them around. So I do see the role of the state as extremely important, but it's not, I don't see it as an entrepreneur the way somebody like Maria Mazzucato would put it. I don't see it as just a purse that is there to disperse money into entrepreneurs and then to insist that they share the results with the public. I see the state in this sense as a collective democratic infrastructure, which is reflexive, and which in a sense is there to analyze how to make this infrastructures of becoming and discovery more effective, and also then how to capitalize, if you will, sorry to use a capitalistic term, but how to capitalize and build on some of the discoveries and creations that have emerged in that process. So the state here is extremely important. The idea of the state as an operating system, it's some extent, it's very simple. I do think that if you look at the way Apple iOS, so their operating system, or Android in the case of Google operate, they have a very interesting, flexible view of what constitutes a basic need and what constitutes an individual need. So if you look at your phone in Android, maps and note-taking and voice recording, they'll provide it as essentially something that everybody needs, and every single operating system has it, right? But then you can also go and furnish your phone with all sorts of individual apps that you'll download from an app store of some kind, and then it will customize your phone in all sorts of various ways. The cool thing is that because these companies are sitting on all this data about what people are using and what they're downloading, they can actually understand which of these highly personalized, customized needs they can eventually fold into the platform or into the operating system. So they have a way to translate this emerging needs that are only now beginning to emerge into permanent or semi-permanent features of this broader infrastructure. So from an app, you become part of an infrastructure, even if you still call an app. And it's not the worst of models for how to think about what the state should be doing in this space. It should be offering certain infrastructures for everybody for free, hopefully. But at the same time, it should be always be on the lookout for this emerging techniques, insights, ways of doing things, which once packaged properly can be integrated and become part of that infrastructure. And for me, that's one of the roles that the state should do. And then, you can actually learn quite a lot from these platforms, the way in which they work with developers, the way in which they subsidize their work, they integrate them into the ecosystem. I mean, it's not a trivial, it's not a trivial thing. And it's not just about kind of turning politics into a startup. I think that there is something fundamental to be learned here about how infrastructures are to be built, and it has to be thought through properly by forces of the left.
Evgeny, I really want to thank you for your thought-provoking talk and for the generosity of your time. I think we should all live with this last idea that you mentioned, that we should stop focusing on all these distractions, as you call it, and we should focus on questioning fundamental premises of these new systems that we want to create. And in this realm, I think there's a huge space for designers, as you say, in many domains, from strategic to graphics to products, to make a difference. So thank you so much. I'm going to pass now the Zoom to Trinidad if she wants to close it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Jean y Delfina, por la masterclass de hoy. Realmente es muy interesante lo que planteas, y sí, tenemos que ver cuáles son estos nuevos caminos, ¿no? Y sobre todo desde el Estado, las políticas públicas que realizaremos en el futuro, incluyendo el diseño y las disciplinas que sean necesarias, tal como tú comentabas en la presentación, para que esto ocurra. No limitarse, sino que estar en una expansión de ideas y de creatividad. Delfina, muchas gracias por la moderación de hoy, excelente como siempre, el año pasado también, siempre con reflexión y aportando ideas que tienen que ver con el proceso que estamos viviendo en Chile, que es un proceso único y que esperemos que desde el diseño y las disciplinas que nos acompañan podamos generar transformaciones en las distintas plataformas y mundos, ¿no? que podemos ir creando. Muchas gracias a todos y todas los que nos acompañaron hoy. Quisiera dejarlos invitados para mañana. Tenemos un día bastante interesante hablando justamente de futuro, diseñando futuros posibles. Tenemos en la mañana a las 10 la masterclass de diseño especulativo con Jean-Paul Milly. Así que estaremos conversando sobre diseño especulativo, qué se entiende como el uso del diseño, no para crear cosas, sino que ideas de futuros posibles, empleando la técnica como instrumento crítico y reflexivo. Él nos dará una introducción a esta práctica y ofrecerá un panorama crítico sobre cómo estamos pensando el futuro. Y después, a las 11:30 mañana, tenemos el panel de arte y diseño, en donde estará otra conocida de la casa, que es Alice Black. Ella es exdirectora del Design Museum en Londres, y estaremos con Helga Schmidt conversando sobre esta vinculación, las distintas plataformas que existen y cómo podemos generar una colaboración desde el ámbito creativo y artístico para este tránsito en el que estamos viviendo en el diseño hoy. Así que muchas gracias. Todo lo encuentran en la plataforma de diseño, mesdeldiseño.cl, y recordarles que esta masterclass quedará grabada en el canal de YouTube de Economía Creativa, de la plataforma que tenemos desde el Ministerio de la Cultura, las Artes y el Patrimonio de Chile. Así que muchas gracias a nuestros invitados y nos estamos viendo próximamente. Chao.
Gracias a todos.